When I was a kid, I had an experience in Mexico that has haunted me. I'm not even sure it really happened or if it was just a nightmare. I was on a road trip with my parents driving down through Mexico heading for Guadalajara to see family and take a vacation. I had turned 10 the month before. The first part of the trip was amazing. We filled the long hours on the road with games and songs. We stopped at tourist traps to see weird stuff and get souvenirs. I remember it was the last time my parents looked genuinely happy. Before that trip, they had fights now and then, but they never lasted long, and in between they seemed happy. But after what happened in Mexico, their smiles never reached their eyes, if they bothered to smile at all. All of this started when we arrived at a small gas station. There was only one car at one of the only two pumps, and it was empty except for a long dark figure sitting in the back seat, not moving. I couldn't stop staring at this man. He sat staring straight ahead, still as a statue. I thought it must be a prop for a Halloween decoration, because he looked like one of those mummies I remembered from a museum we had stopped to see. I didn't like that place, and my mom didn't either. My dad tried to explain it was a part of history, and that we should look on the face of death sometime in our lives. They ended up having the only argument they'd had up to that point in the trip, but once we left they seemed to forget it. The man looked like one of those mummified people we had seen behind glass. His skin was hard and dry as wood, his eyes were sunken, and his hair was stringy and black, and sat on his head like dried algae. I thought maybe it really was one of the mummies from the museum. Maybe someone was moving it or had stolen it. When my dad got back to pump the gas, he told my mom that the owner of the car had just gotten out and walked out into the plains without saying a word. He had talked with the station owner and said he had called a tow truck to take the car away so customers could use the pump. He didn't say anything about the figure in the back. Even when my dad went over and looked inside, it was like he couldn't see him. When I looked back at the thing in the car, I nearly peed my pants when I saw it was looking at me. I yelled and scrambled to the other side of the car, scaring my mom, who asked what was wrong. When I told her about the man in the backseat, she just looked confused and said no one was there. When I looked back, I felt a wave of relief when I saw it was empty. My dad got back in the car and was looking over the road map they had been using. I could tell something was bothering them. They argued about the road they were on and which way would get them where they wanted to go. I looked back at the car and still saw nothing, reassuring myself. What did I see? A ghost? A dream? My parents were arguing more loudly now, and I looked over to see if the station owner was watching. What I saw instead made my heart stop in my chest. The man was standing just outside the door on the opposite side of the car. He was tall, so I could only see his dirty pants and his sunken stomach. I saw he wore a filthy trench coat that was patchy and worn through at the elbows and shoulders. He leaned down to look through the window at me and grinned. That's when I saw his eyes were hollow pits, empty craters that looked bottomless even in the bright daylight. His thin leather lips drew back from his dusty yellow teeth and black dried gums in a mockery of a smile. I couldn't hear my parents anymore. I could only hear the roar of my heart beat in my ears. How had they not seen him? Why hasn't the gas station owner come out to question why this man was harassing his customers? When the door handle clicked and began to open, I tried to scream, but only made a dry hissing sound. I grabbed for the handle of the door as I saw the head of the man ducking to enter the car. I spilled out of the car, scraping my knees on the cracked road, and Crab walked away, staring at the dark man as he crawled into the back seat like a withered spider. My parents noticed me and stopped arguing, getting out to ask what was wrong. I pointed at the man in the back seat, but they looked and saw nothing. I shouted that there was a strange man in the back, but my dad went over and looked closely, his face only inches away from the man's, before turning back and looking visibly frustrated. My mom looked sympathetically at me, but my dad seemed to lose all patience, returning to his argument about the map with my mom. She compromised with him about it just to get back on the road and told me to get in. I looked at the man, who had taken the seat next to mine, and sat as he had in the car before, only he was looking at me, baring his teeth in a skeletal smile. I refused to sit with him, even when my mom begged and began losing her patience. My dad looked ready to hit me and got out of the car and screamed for me to get in or he'd leave me there. I had never seen my dad like that before. It was a betrayal that cut deep, severing something precious and irretrievable. I was afraid of my father for the first time, and it was like losing faith in God. I got up and went to sit next to the man without looking at him. After slamming the door so hard it nearly cracked the window, my dad drove off with a squeal of tires that frightened both me and my mother. Time seemed to pass in bundles, sometimes unbearably slow, and suddenly moving forward without notice. The dark man sat motionless as he had before, staring blankly ahead without a sound. The car smelled stale and rotten, like a long-dead animal baked and bleached by the sun. My mother complained about the smell many times, but my dad would snap at her and tell her to ignore it. There were no songs now, no road games or stops for anything. I had to beg my dad to stop so I could use the bathroom, and he only did when my mom began to beg him as well. The whole time we were stopped, my dad paced impatiently, looking like a man who was extremely late for work or feared being caught by unknown pursuers. They argued constantly, fighting over the directions, arguing about where they were. Yet still my dad drove on. One of the arguments ended when he began to scream so viciously, I saw spit dripping from his chin, and his face had gone a plum color. My mother was threatening to jump out of the car to get away from him, and he laughed cruelly, daring her to try. I cried in the back, yelling for them to stop fighting, and my dad spun around to glare at me with a hatred I had never seen before. I shrunk back into my seat and said nothing. The man next to me had turned to me, his empty eyes seeming to draw in the air from the car, and his rawhide lips pulled back in a toothy smile. We drove for what must have been days, never stopping unless forced to by nature. My dad looked like a damned soul, gripping the steering wheel so tight I could see crumbs of leather falling from it. My mother either sat silent and impassive, like an empty shell, or she sobbed quietly until my dad would bark at her to stop. All the while, the dark man sat in silence, like a man on a bus heading home from work. It was during a particularly heated argument over the upcoming town that my mom finally snapped and began slapping and clawing at my dad, who bellowed like a wounded bear, trying to protect himself and keep the car under control. I was screaming in the back as the car swung from side to side. There was a loud thud like a slab of meat dropped on a wooden floor, and my mother reeled away, covering her face. My dad regained control, wiping blood from his eyes and focusing on exiting the highway. We had come to a small town that looked abandoned, and the sun had turned a burnt orange on the horizon. The car slid to a stop, and my dad turned the car off and took the keys out in one motion. The engine ticked slightly and hissed as the various mechanisms settled within it. I could hear my dad breathing heavy. He was staring ahead blankly, like a man in a trance. Then my mother got out of the car and walked away, heading out away from the ghost town they had arrived at. The car was thick with silence that rang in my ears. I could hear my dad's heavy breathing begin to hitch and shudder. His eyes were shining and red. I looked at the dark man beside me and heard the click of the door opening. Silent as a spider moving across his web, he exited the car with strange, unnatural movements before turning to look back at me inside. He lifted a long bony finger to his dry lips and made a rattling hiss that sounded like the wind passing through bones. Then he turned and walked toward the town, moving with a liquid smoothness that made no sound and disturbed no ground. I watched the world darken as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and somewhere out there, I heard the cries of coyotes. My dad took a long breath and let it out with a shudder. He looked back at me and began to sob openly. Somehow, seeing my dad weep uncontrollably was more terrifying than seeing him in rage. I had no idea what to do or what to say. I wanted to open the door and run out into the desert, just to get away from everything. The sounds of the coyotes yelping and barking kept me from leaving the car. After a while, my dad seemed to calm down and slumped over on the steering wheel. He must have fallen asleep because he didn't react when the coyote calls came closer to us. It was full dark now, and my mom left the door open when she walked away. I could see a vision of the coyotes jumping in through the open door and attacking my dad as he was slumped helplessly over the wheel. I moved and my body felt like it was moving through pudding. The muscles ached from the tension. I managed to crawl forward enough to pull the car door shut with a loud slam that cut the sounds of the outside world off like a switch. I was afraid for my mom out there, worried she wouldn't come back or would be attacked by wild animals. I locked the doors and laid down across the back seat, the smell of the strange man still lingering. I must have fallen asleep because one moment it was dark and the next the sky had turned a lighter blue. When I sat up, my dad was awake and looking out at the morning. He asked if I'd seen Mom, and I told him not since she walked away. He looked down with a shame that made my chest hurt. He started apologizing, and I tried to reassure him, but he just kept saying he was sorry over and over. I pointed out a car coming toward us, and he seemed to brighten. The car pulled up to us and my mother got out, sending a wave of relief over me. My dad choked slightly and got out. They looked at each other for a moment, hesitating, before hugging and shaking with sobs. The man had picked up my mother on the side of the road, saying he spotted a large pack of coyotes following behind her. She told him where we were and he brought her back, offering to help them figure out the map. Once the sun had risen fully, I got out and looked around the car. I could see a circle of prints around it in the dust, and even a few on the hood where something had jumped up in the night to stare inside at us. The man who helped my mom was confused how we ended up at this ghost town. With the map he showed us that we'd gone hundreds of miles off course. Both my parents were stunned and claimed the map they had been using showed them a completely different area. Before the man left, I went to him and told him about the dark man who sat next to me that my parents couldn't see. He almost jumped back at this, making the sign of the cross. He told me the man was a Brujo, a dark witch that spread misery and death wherever they went. He made me promise not to speak of him to anyone and to try not to think of him at all. Doing so may draw him back to me. After that, my parents decided to end our vacation early. The drive home was silent, but not as tense as before. They talked little about what had happened, my mother claiming she felt a wave of relief when she had gotten a distance away from the car, and my dad saying he felt the same relief sometime after she had left. I said nothing, focusing on the passing scenery to keep the memory of the Brujo from my mind. After that trip, my parents were never the same. They never laughed or smiled at each other, and only rarely smiled at me. Something had been taken from them, it seemed, like a vital part of their happiness was crushed out forever. I never saw the Brujo again, and I never told anyone about it until now. I can hear coyotes in the distance as I write this. I'm worried this may have been a mistake to write. I don't care anymore. The memory has been sitting on my mind like a spoiled lump, poisoning me. I had to get it out. Whatever happens, happens.